Okay, great. So can everyone hear me? Let me get like a thumbs up. Okay, cool. So you guys can hear me. Can you see my screen? Yeah, you can see. Okay, perfect. So we can start. So I actually want to start off with a story about something that happened to me a few years ago. So I was interviewing for this test engineering position at this company, and I was super, super nervous. So I go into the interview and everything, I think it's going well, and I'm answering all of the questions correctly. But at the end of the interview, the guy asked me if I had any questions for him. So since this was a test engineer position, I asked him about their staging environment and like how do releases work with the different testing environments. And he stopped me and he said that they don't have a staging environment. They test in production. And I was so shocked. I was so confused. Like, what do you mean you test in production? Like, people don't do that. Like, I was so confused and I was sitting in the middle of this interview. Like, what do I say to that? So he asked me to do something because he could see that I was so confused. He asked me to do something that I want all of you to do now. So I want everyone to think about the last feature that your team deployed. Okay, so everyone's thinking about it. Think about the last feature that your team released, that your team deployed. Okay, got it? Is it working? Right now? In production? How do you know? Your users haven't reported anything to you and your alarms haven't gone off, but you don't know, right? Testing in production is the only way to know that your features are working right now in production. So what do I mean when I say testing in production? I mean testing your features in the environment where your features will live, right? So it's not a replacement for all of your testing, which we'll talk about later, and it's also not the end of the world. So I know there's a raise hand option on the bottom of your screen. You should be able to raise your hand. So I want everyone, if you use a test environment or a staging environment, please raise your hand. That's it. Only 3 of you use a staging environment? Okay, I'm sure many more of you use a testing environment. And the thing is, with a test environment, I can guarantee you it's not the same as staging because it's not a replica of production. How many of you think that your staging environment is an exact replica of production? None of you. That's true because it's not. So what's wrong with staging environments? This is some of the stuff that I've learned through my experience with staging. So staging environments are really expensive to maintain. So generally it costs about $100,000 per year for each staging environment. So when you have 2, 3, 4, 5 staging environments, this is going to add up. Staging test results do not always match production test results. So think about when you're developing a feature, you develop it and then you go to staging and you test it and you worked so hard on testing every requirement in staging and you went through the documentation with your product owner and you worked with your developers to fix all the bugs and everything works great in staging. You feel so good. And then as soon as you launch the feature to production, it breaks. These environments are just different, plain and simple. Production includes data that staging doesn't have. So you're never going to know the differences between your test environment and production until you test there. And no one cares if staging is broken. Like, no one's going to get a call in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner if staging is down. Like, nobody cares. And the load in staging does not match production. So when you think of the number of people who use your staging environment versus the number of people who use your production environment, the difference is a lot. And because the load is different, the accuracy of speed and lag times will also be different. And at the end of the day, I've never heard anyone speak highly of their staging environment. But I know what you're thinking, like testing and production, what could go wrong? But what's the first thing you do right after you deploy a feature? You go to production and you test it, right? So I learned that what stops most companies from testing in production is fear and lack of trust in their systems. And for the same reason, companies refuse to invest in the tools and the process changes that are going to generate this trust, right? You guys are scared. Like, it makes sense. It's a scary topic. It can be very risky, right? There's a lot of risks associated with testing in production. So it can affect real end users, and it can affect reporting and business decisions, and it can affect your third parties, right? But we're going to walk through exactly how to set up tests in production. And we're going to address these risks as we go through them. So the first step of testing in production is to install the necessary tools. And the first tool you need is feature flagging. Feature flagging is kind of the key of testing in production. It's a way to decide who sees which features at which time. So this is kind of what it looks like. So basically, our developers would create a feature flag from the UI and then target all of our internal teammates. So dev, QA, product, design, and our automation bots. So anything related to the feature can only be seen by the users that are inside of this feature flag, because the default for the flag is off right now. And the people on the right, these end users, they can't see anything related to the feature. So if there happens to be a bug in the new feature, it has no impact on your end users because they don't have access to it. And while the feature flag is off, I'm going to go in as a developer, as a test engineer, as a product person. I'm going to go in and I'm going to test everything. I'm going to test all the functionality. I'm going to fix all the bugs. I'm going to make sure that it works in production. And then once I know my feature is working in production, I turn on the feature flag, already knowing 100% that my features are working in production and I didn't break anything that was existing. And now my end users are happy and they're dancing because they have a perfect feature. We didn't ship any bugs. And then you repeat this process for every new feature. So the next tool that you need after a feature flagging framework is an automation framework. And I'm going to give you some recommendations for what I like for an automation framework. And then you also need a job scheduler that's going to run your tests for you. And this can also just be like a simple cron job in Jenkins. And then the last tool you need is an alerting tool. And it's important that you get an alerting tool that can be integrated with your job scheduler. And again, everyone on your team owns product quality, so everyone is going to be on call in your alerting system. So these are some of my recommendations for tools. I don't have time to go through all of them right now, but these are some of the tools that I've used and that have worked well for testing in production. So the next step after you have all of your tools is to carefully create your test data. And the problem we have with test data in production is that we don't want to affect real end users. We don't want anything that we do to be a part of the real world, right? So the solution to this is to create a consistent naming convention for our test users. And what this is gonna look like is kind of like a Boolean. So it's going to say like, is test user is equal to true for all of our test users. And these test users look like real users and they act like real users on the site, but we know that because they have this flag that it's a test user. And then we have a back-end flagging system used to identify all of our testing entities. So if the flag was on, you know that this page or this object or this thing is a testing entity and it should not be included in any data and analytics, right? So then in your automation scripts, you follow these predetermined guidelines, right? Okay, so I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go through this a little bit more quickly. So the next step is to write your tests, and I personally like BDD because it's easy to read and easy to write. And then when you're handling third parties, what's worked best for me is to have a header in the API request that you send to the third party and then tell them, hey, any request that you get with this header is coming from a test, so I want you to handle it differently, and then just tell them what you want. And the last step is to deploy to a production canary. And what this does is it minimizes the impact if something goes wrong. So you roll out the change to a small subset of users before you roll it out to the entire population. And just to summarize, for risk mitigation, before launch, use feature flags to target users. And then after launch, use production canaries to limit your audience. And of course, the outcome was very high, very positive. It promotes a very proactive engineering culture. I'm going to skip all of this. And I just want to say, in case you haven't been paying attention at all for the past 10 minutes, I want you to take away two things from this talk. The first thing is that no one cares if your feature is working in staging. We care if it works in production. And the second thing is that the only way to know if it's working in production is to test it in production. So I'm Talia. Here's my contact info. I'm on Twitter. I'm on, you can email me. I have content news stuff on Twitter all the time. So thank you so much for having me. And have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you so much, Talia. Ahora vamos a movernos a la charla de Jorge Niño desde la ciudad de Bogotá.